Welcome to Breakpoint this week. I'm Shane Morris, here with John Stonestreet to talk about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. You can find links to all of the stories that we're talking about by visiting breakpoint.org, where you're going to find commentaries and resources every day to help you think and live like a Christian in today's culture. John, remember when we talked about not expecting the troubles of 2020 to disappear after the new year? I think, to quote, is it Glenn Sunshine, our friend Glenn Sunshine, who said this first? How's that working out for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to even make a joke, but the only meme that so far I found I at least appreciated was a picture of the Joker with his arm around the clown from It.
Yeah, it's Pennywise.
Pennywise, and it was like 2020 showing 2021, the new job site
around the office.
Like
yeah, I saw the one of the one protester with the bull horns or whatever, the Viking outfit, and it said it said thank God 2020 is over, and it said 5 days into 2021. And they showed that picture.
And of course, none of this is in any sort of sense funny at any level.
No. But you do what you have to do to cope.
Okay. We call memes coping mechanisms.
Yes.
There we go. I mean, it's an astonishing thing to watch something that you're used to seeing on the news with other countries happening in D.C.
Yeah.
It was hard enough this summer to watch cities. The violence, erupt in cities, and protests turned into riots, and riots turned into vandalism and theft. But to see a building that is the center of really you kind of think, what other building more symbolizes America? Maybe none. Maybe the White House. That's the only thing really close. And not only that, but the fact that there were the vast majority of individuals that are part of the American government in the building at the time of the incident,
carrying out their constitutionally prescribed duties to certify the recent election. That was what hit home for me, John. Actually, it was really when I saw the reactions from overseas. There's this sense that Americans have, especially when I think the instigators of something like this are quote unquote my people. They're the ones that are sort of more closely identify politically with my group. I look at it and I think, well, it's it can't happen here. It can't really be that bad. But then I saw reactions from other world leaders, and it was the same kind of reaction I would give if I saw another country's central government collapsing before my eyes. And in a very real sense, that's what was happening yesterday. At least what was attempted was the disruption of the peaceful transition of power that we've talked about for the last several weeks here on this program.
It was, and the truth be told, it's very rare that a country just goes out with a bang. Like one
Right.
incident like that. Usually, these sorts of things are one of many incidents that shows a steady, slow decline into the abyss, and it certainly is a sign of a betrayal of what the American experiment is about, a compromise of anything that we might think of as American exceptionalism, and so on. But here's the thing, and I said this in a commentary on Breakpoint the very next day. It's the absolute wrong analysis when several political leaders said this, and certainly several media commentators, this isn't America that we're watching right now. This isn't the way we do things. And what does that mean? It is now the way we do things.
Well, that's what President Biden or President-elect Biden said in his response to it immediately afterwards. He said, "This isn't us." And otherwise the speech I thought it was very presidential and dignified. It was good. It was a good speech. But when he said, "This isn't us," that question pops into your mind, like you said in the commentary. What if it is us? What if this really is a representation of where America is right now?
At what point does it stop being does an incident stop being an anomaly? How many incidents like this do we get before it's not an anomaly? How many times do we represent the fact that we are unable to govern ourselves in a particular context, and it might be quote unquote us this time, and it might be quote unquote them last time or next time. And the collective result is, listen, we are no longer a nation that can claim the capacity to govern ourselves. This is the oldest thing that has ever been said about the American form of government, which we're all now looking at going, maybe it's more vulnerable than we think, is that not just anybody can sustain this. Yeah. Now, that's not just true, by the way, of the American form of government. This is something that Os Guinness said, freedom to win. We talk about when we celebrate July 4th or whatever, we won our freedom. Winning freedom is unusual but not rare in world history. The thing that's absolutely fundamentally rare, Oz says, and he's right, is sustaining freedom.
Yeah, sustaining freedom for 2.5 centuries. That's what's rare.
Right, and beyond 2.5 centuries, and then you also think too. We kind of look back at history, and we look at something like the collapse of Rome, and we read it in history as if it happened overnight, and that's the kind of the mental image. It's like then there was Rome, and then there was not, and there was barbarians in the middle. I mean, the collapse of Rome is centuries long, and it also isn't one event that does it. It's conditions. That's the other thing that I was immediately reminded of a book called The Content Trap. And, it's interesting. The application in this book has nothing to do with the way I used it for the commentary. But in The Content Trap, they're asking about what makes something go viral, right, as a piece of content and what doesn't. And they use the illustration in the book. The author does. Amon is his last name. I can't remember his first name. I don't have the book in front of me. But in 1988, the Great Yellowstone fires lasted for about 3 months, burned almost 1.5 million acres. And the story you hear, history, is that somebody dropped a cigarette. Well, 1 million people drop cigarettes every day. Probably a whole bunch of people dropped cigarettes that particular day in Yellowstone. Right. And there was even lightning strikes that day. What made the difference for the cigarette? And it's the fact that it was the environment. There's so many pre-existing conditions. And by the way, it's not just pre-existing conditions, but the pre-existing conditions determine how you react to the trigger event, right? So the way, for example, the fire management of Yellowstone responded, same thing yesterday. If we aren't able to look at this and see it for what it really is, then even our response to these unbelievable events of seeing people occupying the Capitol in a violent, unruly, and so on way, that even becomes part of the decline. Does that make sense?
Right.
If you're not able to actually see this is what happened and this is what we need to own up to, and unfortunately, the day after or 2 days after, here on Twitter, it's clear we're not seeing what we need to see.
Well, there's even conspiracy theories about, almost predictably, about how this is a false flag operation and those weren't really right-wingers and it was really Antifa or something like that. And you really have to back up at some point and go, well, what if this is us? And by us, we mean not just the nation as a whole, but our political tribe, the people with whom I most closely identify, whoever that is. When you see Antifa riots and you see the destruction that a left-wing mob unleashes and whatever, pick your city from this past summer in America, you don't look at that and say, well, maybe it was infiltrated by the other side and they're trying to make them look bad, or maybe it was just a few bad apples or whatever. You look at that and you unequivocally condemn it. And I kind of posted on Facebook this little test. If you look at what happened in D.C. Yesterday as we record this, but earlier this week, and you think to yourself, I don't really see what the fuss is about. I don't see what the big deal is. Just imagine that the shoe was on the other foot. Imagine that this was a left-wing mob. Imagine that they were trying to disrupt the counting of vote or the certification of electoral college votes for a right-wing president. Imagine that the current left-wing president had, in this imaginary scenario, had gotten up and given a speech about how the election was stolen from him, and how he wanted his followers to make themselves heard to Congress as they counted the votes. No, but I don't think anyone on the right would look at that and say, "Oh, that's no big deal." The outrage would be incalculable, and rightly so. And this goes back to an exercise that I've just been doing personally throughout this whole hyper politicized, hyper tribal season that we're in, is to ask myself, what would it be? How would I be reacting if the shoe was on the other foot? If this was the other guys doing this, whoever the other guys are in any given instance, and it's really revealing. And I'm not trying to say that to equate, political parties or to equate political platforms or anything like that. I'm saying that part of our core identity as Christians engaging in politics has to be integrity, right? It has to be truth, and it has to be standards. That's part of what this nation is built on, is the idea of equality before the law. And equality before the law is just rooted in the virtue of justice. And if we're not willing to apply those standards across the board, and that manifests as respecting the electoral process, for instance. If we're not willing to do that, then we can't really have a nation. And worse than that, I think we're probably mortgaging away our very integrity. That's not something we can do. That's a scary place to be as Christians, as citizens.
Well, look, I want to just maybe point out. Let me start that over. Yeah, let me just point out one more thing, and that is that all the things that we are seeing here, and for those that have been felt forced and to make kind of political utilitarian decisions, choosing between the worst of two options and all that sort of stuff, and people feeling like they're backed in a corner. So what do I do now? I think there's a lot of that, and I want to honor and respect that. But I want to also point out, first and foremost, that what we have seen in the last few days, what we have seen in the last month, since a month and a half or 2 months since the election, November 3rd, what we saw in the vulnerability of cities, of communities, of cultures, all of these things are not politically caused realities. They're pre-politically. The politics of it are the triggers. The brokenness of it is pre-political. For example, let's just even say, and I agree with you so far, at least everything that I've seen, the whole idea of a false flag, that Antifa was, doing this and portraying this. And let's say, even for a sake of argument, that there were some Antifa actors in there, which, could still be found out. They weren't all that. The guy that occupied Nancy Pelosi's desk and said he's willing to die for it, that's not it. The level of anxiety, cultural anxiety, that brought this up to a breaking point, that has nothing to do with Antifa. That has to do with how right now the resources that are typically available within a cultural environment for stability, for calm, for discourse, space for disagreement. In the American context right now, almost all of that is gone. And so everything has been escalated to an incredible degree. And so much feels at stake. And everything rests on this very kind of fragile political thing that we have. And that's that's where we're at. This is a remarkable opportunity for the church to point to these other things and to start rebuilding these other things. But our culture right now is not giving us the resources that most Americans need to not dive into the deep despair that of not getting what you want politically. Does that make sense? There's not enough resources more broadly in culture to protect us from our own base instincts, to mitigate the fall. And so that's what we're seeing, is this rejection of what Abraham Lincoln called our better angels. And I guess the question, and there's going to be 1 million people. In fact, I'm sure we'll get emails. I got plenty already from the commentary this week saying, "But what if? But what if? But what if?" If we what if every single incident, saying we're going to miss the larger decline into the abyss that we're in the middle of. And that's one of the reasons I ended my commentary on Thursday talking about Ross Douthat's book on decadence, The Age of Decadence, Because what he's realizing is, again, this won't be, and I think that some of the reports on this have even crossed the line into kind of, using words that probably don't apply to what was still a really, really bad situation. There wasn't a risk of the American experiment, completely going down in flames because of this awful incident, as awful as it still was. But it is a signpost on what I think, and I think Douthit is right, and I'm going to air my interview with him on his book again next week on the Breakpoint podcast because of it, that this decadence is a long decline, and you have these signposts on the way. And there's only two things that get a civilization out of decadence, Ross says, and this was what was on display this week. One is revolution, which apparently people misguidingly think that they can do, and that this is the cause to do it for. The other is religious revival. So there you have it: decadence, revolution, or revival. Yeah. That seems to be the multiple choice test ahead of us right now.
Take your pick, folks. We'll be right back after this to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Stay with us. We're back here on Breakpoint this week talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. John, the thing we were going to talk about first before all of the events of Wednesday went down was the outcome of the Georgia Senate runoff, where two races flipped from the expected outcome initially, and we ended up with a reversal in the Senate here. Now, the United States Senate, thanks to the election of these two Democrats, is now going to be at the beginning of Joe Biden's term in the control of the Democrats. So there's kind of a trifecta: Congress, Senate, the House, the Senate, and the White House. The Supreme Court will be the only branch of the federal government at this point that is not in Democratic hands, at least doesn't have a Democratic majority. And so that changes the picture greatly of what the next 4 years is going to look like. And it's a done deal at this point with both the Senate and the presidential vote being certified. So walk us through this a little bit, because my initial reaction when the election happened back in November was, okay, we've got a Democratic president, but there's going to be deadlock for the next 4 years because the Senate is still in Republican hands, and they can basically shut down Joe Biden's legislative agenda. But it doesn't look like that's going to be the case. And then, of course, we're on a worldview show here, and it's so easy to lose track of that. But let's talk about the implications of that for the church and for Christians, because there are many.
Oh, there are significant ones. And in fact, I'm with you back in November. What it really looked like is that in addition to the legislative branch being really what should have and could have been one of the most lasting parts of President Trump's legacy, and all that, of course, I think has been completely, any possibility of that is completely gone after this week. But the Democrats were really in a very tough position because you do have, obviously, the fact of getting past the firewall of both what at that point we assume was going to be a Republican Senate, and then also the second firewall of the courts. But you also had a really divided Democratic Party between what we call the moderates and the progressives. Now, we'd also say, again, as we've said before, that the moderate wing of the Democratic Party is far more progressive than the progressive wing of it was just 20 years ago, right? Especially on social issues like abortion and LGBT issues and so on. I mean, President-elect Biden literally promised to pass the Equality Act in the first 100 days. And this was an impossibility if the Republicans maintained the Senate. It was really kind of a promise across the bow. But listen, no moderate Democratic candidate would have promised such a thing 20 years ago because it is such a outlandishly progressive promise. Now, take that and put it on the side first, Shane, because you was like, here. You started this segment by going, here's what we were going to talk about.
Yeah.
Do you realize, like, we were going to talk about the fact that there was a very sketchy phone call between President Trump and Georgia election officials about a presidential race that he thought maybe he could help overturn back in his favor. This was done in the context, and the tapes were released in the context of an election this week having to do with Georgia Senate races
Hmm.
that were, all things considered equal, on November the 4th. Most of us assumed that was going to remain in Republican hands,
Right.
because, it was within the margin of victory for the Republicans. Both Republicans was within the margin in which there had to be a runoff according to Georgia law, but it was still significant enough. And now all of that overturned, and what seemed to be completely unrelated, in a Stop the Steal rally in Washington, D.C., in which many members of the GOP really said, well, look, whatever you think about whether Trump really lost the November election, he absolutely lost the Georgia Senate election for the Georgia senators. That is absolutely almost unquestionable, because of the complete flip on this. And people that were part of the
By lost, you mean changed the what would have been the outcome by pushing this
right?
idea
Not that he was a
of
candidate,
election
lost, but
fraud.
yeah,
Right,
that really you could pin the loss of the Georgia Senate seats on, if not the president, on many people in this whole Stop the Steal movement who told Republican voters not to come out and vote because it was rigged anyway. I mean, this was a dramatic week politically. Now, I'm tempted to get my political hack hat on and walk through the details of all of that. And I actually have heard some really, I think, helpful analyses of all this. And then, of course, you had a handful, I guess more than a handful, 147 Republican House members, even after the events of what happened in the Capitol, still challenged election results in Arizona and maybe one other state. I mean, the plan initially, of course, before the chaos was, I think, to do all 6 of the contested states, and there were senators and so on.
Well, I'll tell you what. The reason I opened talking about the memes and such was I take the riots seriously. I really do. Someone died in that incident. That was horrible. But to me, like you said earlier, John, I don't think that had a realistic chance of bringing down the Republic or changing the outcome of the election. What bothered me a lot more was the fact that 147 Republicans in the House and then a few in the Senate, voted against certifying the election results on the basis of, as best I can tell and have been able to tell over the last few weeks, zero credible evidence that there was a landslide victory for Trump that was, turned in Biden's favor by a bunch of fraudulent votes. That's worrisome. Like Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, said, if this had succeeded, if there had been enough votes for this sort of thing to actually block the election results, it would have resulted in a death spiral for our democracy. I mean, what's the next step after the party that lost the election decides to overturn the people's will in Congress? What do you do after that? I don't know.
Using the vice president, essentially. I mean, you can only really do it if you have the vice president of the Senate. And Mike Pence showed that he was going to follow the rule of law and his constitutional duty. And that was really helpful. There's at least a handful of clarifications, and I'm going to offer a charitable take. And I recognize that charitable take could be absolutely wrong. I was, in an unrelated note, a friend emailed me this week and pointed to a tweet from a mutual friend, and said, how horrifying. And I said, well, this person didn't really say this. In the context, it looks like they say this, but maybe it was just tone deafness. And this person wrote me and said, well, that's really charitable. And I guess at some level I'm thinking maybe we need to be a little more charitable instead of assuming the worst. Now,
sure, I'm
probably I could very well be wrong on both counts, and I don't want to do it in a way that's foolish or that undermines the evil. But let me say it. First of all, it's not, I don't want to say unusual, but it's not unprecedented for House members to challenge election results and whether an elector in a particular state is legitimate.
Sure.
There was a lot of noise made when, there was one after the other after the other. I think there was a Democratic challenge to every state that elected President Trump, and of course in 2016. Now, there was no senators willing to sign on to it, and you'd have to have the House and the Senate in order to retreat to a vote. And so it was just dismissed. And by the way, at that point, Joe Biden after the first couple really started, who was vice president over the Senate at the time, really started to vocally condemn, basically what was grandstanding by these House members on the Democratic side of President Trump. It also happened, I think, with George W. Bush because of the Al Gore, George Bush Supreme Court thing. So that's not unprecedented. It is unprecedented that senators would go along with it. Now, because that hasn't happened. That was new, and that's what Mitch McConnell was talking about. I do think we know that there are enough Republican House members, some of which were basically challenging those results because of loyalty to President Trump, not because of evidence.
Right.
I think there are others. I'm thinking of. I don't want to name names because I don't know the intention of the heart, but I do want to say some that would say, look, our intent was never to overturn the election because it was impossible, but the way, state election laws, and I think probably the most glaring case that needs to be looked at, even though the results aren't nearly enough to change the election in that state, is Pennsylvania. That how this was done was outside of the procedure and outside of the Constitution, outside of the state constitution. So challenging it is a way to say, look, we need to get back in the lines, even though we know this is not even going anywhere. That's the charitable read on it, and I'll leave it at that. Now, the bigger worldview thing is this. 4 years ago, when President Trump was elected, some of us who were weary and disarrayed after the last 4 years of the Obama presidency, and remember kind of the aggressive social agenda that was implemented both domestically and also in foreign policy, said, we can call this a reprieve. In other words, this doesn't fix the problems that we have. This isn't going to stop the train. This is, of progressive items that challenge religious liberty, challenge the dignity of life, challenge the sacredness of marriage, challenge common sense sexual morality, challenge the rights of children. This isn't going anywhere, but we've got a reprieve. Well, folks, let me just say it. The reprieve is over. And after the Georgia Senate elections, even though we should have, those of us on the side of social conservative, I'm not talking about those of us on the side of the Republicans, I'm talking about those on the side of the social conservative issues, there were two firewalls. There was a Senate that was unwilling to go there, and there was a Supreme Court. The Senate now is gone. All there is now is the courts. And there's an awful lot of pain. I'll give you one example, and I know we need to cut it short here. The clearest example is the Equality Act. President-elect Biden said in his campaign that he, if elected, would bring the Equality Act into law in the first 100 days. That's an impossibility if the Senate is under Republican control. That's an impossibility. There's a potential impossibility depending on what the Supreme Court sees and the rights. Now, one of those firewalls is gone. And between whenever this thing goes and any sort of federal challenge, we know that the Supreme Court is very hesitant to do kind of wholesale sorts of upendings of federal legislation. Just consider Obamacare, right? It was very hesitant. Right. It was like piecemeal, right? A piecemeal sort of approach, if the Equality Act becomes law, is going to mean a lot of pain, a lot of hurt, a lot of bad things in place for a long time. And this could definitely impact nonprofits, definitely impact pro-life pregnancy care centers, definitely impact Christian colleges and universities. So that's where we're at, okay? That's what the shenanigans cost in terms of the Georgia Senate race. This is real stuff. We've said this for a long time, Shane. Elections have consequences.
Yeah, but so do lies about elections. So do conspiracy theories about elections, and it's very plausible, like you said, John, that this could have gone a different way if the last few weeks had gone a different way, and if we'd had a president who was offering a different sort of leadership to his party and to the nation, and we didn't have that. And I think we saw the vindication of not only that saying, but the saying that I've heard a lot and I've shared a lot over the last 4 years, which is that character matters. And that wasn't just a platitude, that wasn't just sort of a pearl clutching or something like that. It was really my belief and the belief of many conservatives that that a man who speaks false words, foolish words, things that don't have the support of the evidence or of reason, and that are just malicious and cruel and pointless, there's going to be a consequence for that. Isaac Newton's law of one of his laws of motion is that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And you talked about this being a reprieve in the last 4 years. Well, that may very well have been so if things had gone differently. And there may be aspects of the Trump legacy that live on long term. But it's clear after, I keep saying yesterday because we're recording this on Thursday, but it's clear after the events of this past week, John, that much of that legacy is going to be rapidly undone, not just because the Senate has flipped, but because now there's enormous political will to carry through a sort of left-wing mandate, because the left is going to paint themselves as saving the nation from the right-wing mob at this point. So those kinds of actions, kinds of words, they have consequences.
That right there is the other thing that we have yet to see where that goes, and that's a very, very real possibility. There is no question about it. I know what some folks are thinking, and we'll probably hear from some. But the other side was worse.
I'm sure.
And yeah, I actually would still say that because we're talking about character and policy and character and policy, but that doesn't mitigate at all the consequences of character, right? Yeah. I mean, just because the other side is worse doesn't mean this side is good. And we've got to stop hedging each and every time on this and realize that what all of this reflects is something that predates Trump and predates Biden, even predates Hillary and predates all of that, which is a fundamental collapse of those parts of the culture that were informed by Christian values, family, church, how we teach, what we teach. And as those things have gone away, we become a much thinner culture. We become a much weaker culture. Now, it's really tempting to, in light of all that I said about the reprieve being over and here comes the Equality Act, and then I'm convinced that all that's true, is then to kick and say if only he hadn't, and if only this, and all that could be legitimate, and we need to take stock of that. But the other question we need to ask, and it's something that we're going to look forward to at the Colson Center in a number of ways, both here on Breakpoint this week and Breakpoint, and that is, whatever should have happened differently, here we are.
Yeah.
What kind of people do we need to be now? What is it going to take for Christians? I talk about this all the time with parents and their students. And, when I started kind of helping kids prepare for college and defend their faith, years ago, it was, hey, Christianity is seen as outdated. It's seen as foolish. It's seen as stupid. You need to be smart. And now, when I do it, it's Christianity is seen as evil. You need to be ready not just for the intellectual challenge, but the social ostracization.
Yeah.
That's a hard word to say, but you know what I mean.
Ostracization. Yeah, it is hard. Wow.
It's a whole lot of syllables, and they all and all the ones in the middle are. But the
it's a large bird in Africa.
It's that yeah, and that's what Look, whatever should have been differently, whatever could have been differently. Here we are, and we go back to the truths that we know. Christ is risen. Christ is Lord. Christ will make all things new. And the thing that I, revisited this week again in another commentary, God wants us to be in this cultural moment. Mm-hmm. You and I are here, Shane.
It's not.
We look at it. We look around and go, I can't believe this cultural moment. God put us in this cultural moment. He wants us here as salt and light, or as Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5, as the reconciled ones who have been entrusted with the ministry of reconciliation. So, let's figure out what it takes. Let's figure out how we can support each other. Let's figure out what we need to know. Let's figure out the virtues that we need to re-embrace in our own lives and expect from our communities. And then let's get on with it.
Welcome to 2021, folks. And, I look at this, John, and I think back at on the things we've said about the events of this first week. And I have to remind myself continually of that truth, that we are here for a reason and that we're called to be faithful, not necessarily successful, that the outcome God expects is just that we do the right thing, that we act like Jesus, that we witness to his love and to the truth through our words, through our actions, our behavior, so that, as Peter says, that the Gentiles would look at us, the heathens would look at us and say, and glorify God on the day of his return. We'll be right back after this to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Stay with us. Well, John, I want to hit one more story here because we've been stuck in the United States this whole time, and for good reason. It was a crazy week here in the U.S., but there's some big stuff happening overseas, in particular in an area that we've covered extensively on this program, and that is in Hong Kong, with the whole interplay there with China. Just a couple of decades after the handover took place, police on Wednesday morning arrested 53 elected pro-democracy lawmakers and activists. This is from World, and that's an unprecedented crackdown under the new national security law imposed by Beijing last year. There's an American lawyer, John Clancy, was one of those arrested. Human Rights Commission member, a firm supporter of the pro-democracy activists, and a bunch of citizens of Hong Kong as well who've pushed hard for the things we consider basic freedoms here in the United States. And to my mind, having followed this story for months and almost a couple of years now, this looks like the biggest step in the crackdown so far. I mean, this looks like the final moments of the pro-democracy movement here. It's been winding down for a while, but this is a full-on crackdown. And it made me think, John, about the events in this country and how we've talked about the sacredness of what's happening. Many have talked about the sacredness of what happens on Capitol Hill when the results of a democratic election are confirmed, and it made me compare the two situations. You know, when we say what happens here is sacred, we mean things like we have the right to assemble peaceably. We have the right to criticize our government officials. We have the right to the freedom of speech. We have the right to the freedom of religion. We can worship as we choose. We can go to whatever church we want on Sunday. We can live out our lives to a great extent as Christians in the public sphere. And we talk about the threats to that kind of freedom here. All of that is disappearing in Hong Kong now because of this crackdown on we call it the pro-democracy movement. Really, it's a pro-Western freedom movement. And the communist government of China now is just gobbling up that freedom that has existed in Hong Kong for so long. That's what they've been fighting for. That's what the democracy movement there has been fighting for, and that's why it's so grievous to watch it collapsing. I mean, imagine if that was happening here. Imagine if that was happening to us. If no longer could you speak against the government, no longer could you assemble in the church of your choice, no longer could you do. I mean, all of that is obviously coming in Hong Kong at this point, because the old British system is dissolving and the new Chinese system, the new communist system, I should say, is being imposed on these people. And it's a terrible thing to watch. It involves millions upon millions of citizens who would have considered themselves free not that long ago.
Yeah, and there's also a strong Christian element to the Hong Kong democracy protests, something we've covered on Breakpoint, and we'll link to some of those articles if you come to breakpoint.org. That's an important aspect of this story to understand, and part of that is the power of worldview. Communism comes from an atheistic frame of reference. You can't come up with communism from a Christian frame of reference. The attempts to do so are just kind of ridiculous. I'm not unlike, our new senator-elect from Georgia, a pastor saying I'm a pro-choice pastor. You can be that, but it's not legitimate, right? It doesn't follow. And you'll see this around the world, that there's a strong Christian element to pushes, for freedom in so many ways. Of course, there's also the history of Hong Kong, the promises of China to preserve it as a separately run sort of part of China for 50 years, and we're not even, I think, halfway into that. Mm-hmm. Maybe you're just right around halfway into that. So there's that as well. I think this is also a call to read "Live Not by Lies" by Roger Eyre. I mean, we joke, it's kind of like every every week it's like, oh, there's another way. Maybe Rod, whose hair's on fire, maybe has got this right just a little bit, right? But I tell you, the thing to look at there is the difference between soft totalitarianism and hard totalitarianism in that book, and what we are seeing now with Hong Kong is hard totalitarianism. And what the problem with that is that the American Western media has been absolutely duped on this. In other words, it's like, how many of these things do we have to see? Didn't we just say this about America? How many of these things do we have to see before it's no longer an anomaly?
Right.
Right. But this kind of, well, a break point is forthcoming, and I'm going to give it away. I'm grateful. Our colleague Maria Baer, who's joined us here, is going to be a co-writer on that, and excited about that one coming out because she's pointing to a New York Times article in which the New York Times said, well, China might not have the freedoms that we know, like freedom of religion and freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. But people are free to go to the nightclubs because their communist dictatorship really handled COVID well. I mean, that was the article. It's an astonishing thing, right?
Other than that, how was the play, Mrs. Lincoln? Golly.
Well, and there's so many examples of this. This is one, the rounding up. We talked about this week as well. I listened to an economics podcast in which they were talking about Alibaba's big jump this week. Alibaba is kind of the Chinese equivalent of Amazon and FedEx and 7 other companies there, with 1 billion clients, that sort of a billion customers, and it jumped 30%, and the stock did, and there was one reason. It was a very, very simple reason, and that is that the founder of Alibaba, whose name is Jack Ma, turned out to be alive. Now you said, well, why did they think he was dead? Well, because 2 weeks ago he criticized the Chinese government, and he went missing. So for 2 weeks, the stock has struggled because everyone assumed that the Chinese government had just picked him up, that he was going to disappear, and that the crunches on the Alibaba were going to grow. Now, here's what was funny in the podcast is this was the language used, and you just kind of listen to this going, oh my gosh, the language used was, so in American capitalism, you can criticize things. In Chinese capitalism, and you're like, Chinese capitalism, I mean, capitalism is just not quite yet the right word, where the most important factor on whether a stock jumps or not is whether or not the founder was picked up by the dictator in order to be killed because he dissented.
Yeah. That's what's so jarring about Chinese communism, and its more recent iteration as it's developed in my lifetime. I'm 32. It goes back well before my time, but this new iteration of communism is nothing like the Soviet communism in key areas, and that you never would have heard about American companies kowtowing to the Soviet Union because they had a bunch of business interest over there. That wasn't a thing that happened. I've never heard of that in history books being a thing that happened. It was because they were worried that the Soviets were going to put an ice pick in you, even if you were hiding in Mexico. With China, though, you've got a completely different situation where whether it's the NBA or the New York Times or Disney or any of these other big companies based in America that are just folding before China because the economic interests there are so substantial. It is a weird hybrid.
No one's scared of getting an ice pick in their back. What everyone's scared of is not having access to the billions and billions and billions of customers.
Yeah, because China can just say, boom, you're no longer allowed to do business here. And that is intimidating to all these companies, and it keeps them from doing the right thing. It also exposes their hypocrisy because they're willing to do all sorts of posturing here in the West about LGBT issues and stuff. But when it comes to people literally being rounded up and put in concentration camps, taken from their families, having their basic political rights taken away, it seems like Western companies are mum for the most part.
Well, and part of it is so two quick takeaways, and one will be further explicated in the Breakpoint commentary, is that whenever you read the word freedom in the New York Times, ask the question, what do they mean by that?
Right.
Because the word freedom, to say, well, they might not have the freedoms of speech, of religion, of assembly.
They can hit the club, baby.
That's right. They can hit the club. They have freedom to partay. It's like it's like the New York Times editorial board is the Beastie Boys or something. I mean, it's just what a ridiculous sort of combination.
Oh man.
The other thing that we need to be reminded of, and by the way, people are quickly going to realize that this is the extended version that goes on the podcast where we can make references on things like the Beastie Boys. But the other thing that I think we need to point out is that something that we usually revisit each and every year at the Colson Center at this time, usually at other times too. But this is the time when we have things like the Open Doors World Watch List, and we have things like the Heritage Foundation's economic Index of Economic Freedoms and other freedoms, and we have things that come out that tell us kind of what the state is around the world. And while this isn't specifically a religious freedom story with pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong, although as we said, there's a Christian undergirding to the Hong Kong democracy movement. In China, we know because of the horrific treatment of Muslim Uyghurs, because of ongoing attacks against Christians, against crosses, against churches, and so on. Even rewriting the Bible, we hear, is on the docket for 2021. That this does remind us that the very good things that Americans take for granted, and which, as we started the program with, we are at risk of squandering, not because of them, but because we're because of us, because we're no longer the sort of people who can steward them, that this really matters. It's also worth mentioning, by the way, that one of the countries to keep on our list, we spent a lot of time last year talking about Nigeria, and a little bit of time talking about India. If I were to make predictions for 2021, India is going to be something we talk about more and more. A point commentary that aired this week that was primarily written by our colleague Roberta Rivera told the story of a group of Indian missionaries who were arrested for violating the anti-proselytization laws in their state. They weren't. They were just handing out food.
That's the second really hard word you've said in this episode.
That second one, yeah. Anti-proselytization. But they were handing out food to the hungry and were falsely accused of evangelizing, and there's no justice. There's no really appeal to justice. And get this, India has, I think, if I remember correctly, has now surpassed China on the Open Doors World Watch List. That's crazy. And by the way, that's not a list you want to move towards number one on. That's a remarkable thing. So it is a reminder for all of us too that our persecuted brothers and sisters, that's a very real group of people around the world. Nigeria continues to be an amazing and incredible problem there, as well as some other countries, and this was a reminder of that as well.
And the ones you want to follow on this, John, are the World Watch List by Open Doors. That's a really good one. And then I find that World Magazine and their website, they do an excellent job reporting on these international stories. You know, we have Mindy Bells on the program quite frequently to talk about these kinds of stories. She's been nose to the ground in the Middle East, for instance, for the last few years, but she's great on all this stuff. And so when I want to get a Christian perspective on a lot of these things, find out what the mainstream media, so to speak, is not covering, I often go straight to World for this stuff. It's
well,
great.
Just so everybody knows, Mindy joined me on a webinar this week to talk about a partnership that's Colson Center and World has, but also to talk about this. Mindy's column is called Globetrot. And if you want, I mean, the World Watch List kind of measures it in an index sort of form, like which direction our country's going. Mindy is going to give you stories of, real-time stories of people on the ground and our brothers and sisters around the world. And if you want to see a recording of that webinar that we did, just come to breakpoint.org. We'll provide a link to it. But just know that this is the month. Every January, we partner with World Magazine to offer a subscription to World to our listeners and our constituents. And it's a wonderful deal for any gift to the Colson Center for $19 or more. You get a subscription that you can keep, or if you already subscribe to it, you can actually give it to a friend or a relative. And that's a great deal for a year's worth of World Magazine. Any gift to the Colson Center And so at the same time you're supporting the advancement of Christian worldview and cultural understanding, you're also receiving a resource that if you already subscribe to World, you know how important it is and how helpful it is just to make sense of the chaos, which is one of the big parts of what we do.
So that's not your recommendation this week, I assume, John, although that is
I could
worth
cheat and say,
recommending.
yeah, it's a good one, though.
But I'm going to let you go first this week because you're always belly aching about me going first on recommendations. So let's hear it, John. What's your resource recommendation for the week?
You know, in light of everything that happened, I was going to hold off on this because there's going to be some upcoming resources from the Colson Center, some prayer times, some written commentaries and things like that. But just in light of everything that happened, and stay tuned for all those things. We'll let you know about them. I'm going to recommend Proverbs. I know it's just too simple, but that's the point. There's so many Proverbs now that when I read them, I think this is simple. Of course, everyone knows this, right? But to do it in this cultural moment is a profoundly wise and revolutionary act. And I mean revolution in the good sense. I guess I have to clarify that.
Right.
It really is. It's I often joked with the students that I teach that you can sum up Proverbs in a few words, which is don't do stupid things. And that's actually really helpful because Proverbs is the wisdom book, and it's nothing like other religions. Other religions, their wisdom books are these esoteric nonsense where you've got to kind of escape from the world into some sort of mental state. And, a guy with a long beard says ridiculous things to you. I mean, that's not Proverbs. Proverbs is straightforward. Don't do stupid things. Don't listen to bad people. Hang out with the wise to be wise. Treat others with respect. Don't start bad habits. I mean, there's just so many of these things. A soft answer turns away wrath. These things are observably and kind of gut level, we know them to be true. But I wonder if a profoundly important step for the church right now, as if it's true, for example, that the reprieve is over, that we're going to have to, live in this new moment, both dealing with, criticism that's some just, some unjust, and also then just dealing with the pressure of society, that one of the most important things we can do is go back to Proverbs and just do what it says. Just do what it says. Obviously with the help of the Holy Spirit and with the power of Jesus and his forgiveness and grace. But there's some real wisdom there that I think is not just going to help us personally, but going to be corporately a critical part of our cultural witness as the church in the days ahead. And more to come on that, but read Proverbs.
Yeah, I would summarize the message of Proverbs more like, be a good human or something like that. But don't be stupid is probably catchier. So we'll stick with that.
If Proverbs needs a marketing slogan, I got it. I'm here for it.
Well, John, my recommendation for the week is going to be a movie I watched a couple of nights ago with my kids. It's Disney Pixar's new movie Soul. And this one was really interesting, very experimental. Pixar has a long history of these kind of countercultural and deeply redemptive messages. It's very, very surprising. The more I think about the Pixar canon, the more, with a few exceptions. I mean, a couple of really stupid ones like Cars, but and the Good Dinosaur. I don't know what that was all about, but other than those, there are some really good ones, and often what they're telling kids or audiences of all ages, because this movie is very much one that is multi-layered. There's stuff that kids won't get that the adults are supposed to get, and not dirty jokes. They're existential questions, about life and death. But the things that these movies seem to be pushing us toward are, like I said, countercultural. They seem to, when we value achievement and career and success and fame and beauty and all these things in our culture, Pixar continually keeps pushing us back to family and place and love and self-sacrifice and humility and stuff like that. It's really quite stunning with some of these movies. And one of the more stunning things with Pixar is also that they treat with death frequently. Several people have written about this, but Pixar's dominant theme, I think you can argue, is death. which is really weird. It sounds morbid for this studio making kids movies, but if you think of Toy Story with the whole issue of immortality and that comes up in that, both with living forever, and then the incinerator that at the end of Toy Story 3, where everyone said that's the darkest scene in any kids movie ever, where they almost all get burned up. That's about death. One of the main themes with Up was death. It opens in the first 9 minutes. It's one of the main characters dies, and then the whole rest of it is the other main character grappling with death. Coco, a couple of years, did this. It's about remembering departed family members. And Soul does very much the same thing, but it's about the value and meaning of life. So again, the main character dies. I won't give away a bunch, but if you want to summarize it, It's a Wonderful Life meets The Great Divorce. And I have zero doubt that the people at Disney Pixar, were thinking of It's a Wonderful Life. There's just too many parallels between the two movies. And I doubt the whole staff was thinking of The Great Divorce. There might have been one or two people in there who slipped some stuff in, but there are some parallels there with C.S. Lewis's book. But the message is simple. Basically, it's a rebuke of the career and fame-centric view of purpose. What is my purpose in life? Is it to get the big gig? Is it to make my big break? Is it to get that college degree, or to be famous, or to land my dream job, or whatever? No. According to this movie, it's really to be a human well, like we said with Proverbs. It's to live life, even in the simplest moments, even in the mundane stuff, even in the things that people don't think are typically valuable, and to be able to look back and say, that was meaningful. That was what life is all about there. And it doesn't really matter if I didn't achieve my big headline dreams. It really matters what I did in the small and simple moments. So
it sounds like It's a Wonderful Life-ish.
It's a Wonderful Life. It's exactly the same thing. Your life is meaningful, and it's a guy sort of being able to look back on his life and see, oh, it was deeply meaningful, even though I didn't get a chance to pursue that big dream of mine. Because when he gets back and he gets the chance to pursue the big dream, the main character of this movie finds out it's hollow. He's like, I thought I would have felt different. And, it turns out that wasn't what life was all about. And he learns that. It's very redemptive. And he doesn't stay dead. But I will say there are a lot of New Age elements in it, astral planes, chakras, meditation. And then there's this idea of pre-existence of the souls. Like before you get embodied, your soul is floating in this land of pre-existence or whatever. And I would say, obviously, that's all that stuff that Christians would have big problems with. But I would say two things. Number one, if you feel like your kids aren't ready for that sort of thing and you can't explain it to them, then just make this something for the older members of the family. But number two, I would say most of that's treated like a joke in this movie. It's really, really goofy. I mean, none of it's treated in a serious light. It's almost like a setting where people said with Coco, a lot of people had trouble with the Day of the Dead theme, and the Saint Death imagery and stuff, which is big in Mexico and Latin America. But that wasn't the point of the movie. It was a setting. It was something that they brought in for aesthetic effect and to give them opportunities to really tell their story. So, it's a matter of maturity. It's like, how are your kids ready for Gandalf the Wizard or Dr. Cornelius in Narnia with the magic and stuff? Are they ready to talk about all the river god or whatever C.S. Lewis writes in there? It's a question of maturity. There could be a problem there, but I don't think it's going to be a big deal for most people. So I would recommend it.
And that's a great. I tell you that. I mean, if I can make a sub recommendation of your
Sure.
recommendation, which comes from our good friend and colleague Bill Brown. I learned this from him years ago. Is you should never watch a movie passively. So if don't let Pixar. Don't let Pixar teach your kids those things. Talk
Right.
about those things, right? I mean, we talked about this years ago about Beauty and the Beast, that real live action, and it was either don't watch it, which I think was a legitimate one. It was a legitimate option. It was watch it and hope that your kids don't notice it, or watch it, make sure they notice the quote-unquote moment, and then point
Right.
it out and talk about it. And I tell you, of those three options, the second one is the worst, which is watch it and hope no one notices it. Like, talk about it, bring it up. What a great conversation about, what is the nature of the soul? What is the nature of the body? But I love, by the way, I worked at a Christian college long enough, Shane, and there was this trend of, teaching students about calling. And the attempt was to, teach them a different view than just, occupation, make money, and,
Right.
That sort of stuff. But it often was, God's created you for a special purpose, and if you find that purpose, can you have meaning?
Mm-hmm.
And then you would have somebody where something would go wrong, like a disability, or maybe a relationship that fragmented, or maybe something completely out of their control, or maybe you lived in any other country other than America, and you actually didn't have the luxury of landing that dream job and finding someone to pay you for it. Now, I say that knowing I've landed the dream job and somebody's paying me to do this,
right.
and what a sweet gig this is. But there's also, as we talked about this, the beauty of contentment. I mean, Paul talks about contentment as a calling, and service, and being who God created you to be, wherever that was. So I'm excited to watch Soul with my kids, especially where my kids are starting to kind of think about what they want to be when they grow up, and what their careers are, and what God wants for them. What a great tool for a conversation.
And that's exactly it. It's the point is, what if I don't achieve my dream? What if I don't get to that point where I've made it? Can I still live a good life, a good meaningful life? And it ties with Coco really closely there, because the whole point of Coco is if you give up family, and it's specifically family in Coco, but if you sacrifice the people in your life in order to chase your dream, you're going to become an awful person. You're going to become basically a monster. The people who are willing to give up their dreams first to deal with the more meaningful stuff, the George Bailey stuff in life, those are the people who end up happy and being surrounded by loved ones. So
my only complaint is you said something negative about cars. I love cars.
You love cars?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I honestly, now that I think about it, I think I don't actually know what the moral of
my
cars
wife
is.
does the same thing, John. She's the biggest cars apologist you'll ever meet, and I just don't get it. I've never understood.
I'm not an apologist. I just like it. And now I'm thinking, I don't know why, other than it's got a cool James Taylor song and Larry
right.
the Cable Guy. And that's
Right.
maybe all we need. Maybe
that's all we need.
Maybe that's all we need.
Well, folks, that's it for today. You can visit us at breakpoint.org for links to every one of the stories that we've mentioned today on the program, plus a wealth of resources, and they're always fresh, updated regularly, and they'll help you think and live like a Christian in today's culture. For John Stonestreet and the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. Thanks so much for listening.